We've been taught that superpowers fall because of wars. Rome fell to barbarians. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War. It's a clean narrative, but it's completely wrong. The real pattern is far more predictable, and it's happening right now. Every major empire in history has followed the same 5 steps before collapse, not because of external enemies, but because of internal mathematics, the kind that compounds silently until the system can't support itself anymore. Step 1 starts with currency debasement, not inflation in the way we typically talk about it, but the deliberate destruction of money's purchasing power to fund obligations the state can no longer afford through legitimate revenue. Rome did this literally by reducing the silver content in their coins from 95% to less than 5%. Over 2 centuries. The denarius became worthless, and citizens stopped trusting it. Trade networks that had functioned for generations broke down because nobody knew what anything was actually worth anymore. The United States left the gold standard in 1971, and since then the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. But here's what matters. It's not just about prices going up, it's about trust going down. When a government can't tax enough or grow enough to pay its bills, it prints. And once that starts, it never stops voluntarily, because the alternative is admitting the system is insolvent. Every empire that debased its currency told itself it was temporary, a wartime measure, an emergency provision. It never was. The Weimar Republic, the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, flooding Europe with New World silver. It's the same pattern every time. The money becomes a lie, and commerce starts operating outside official channels. Black markets emerge, alternative currencies, barter systems. The state loses its grip on economic activity, which means it loses tax revenue, which means it prints more, which accelerates the entire cycle. Step 2 is the expansion of bureaucracy beyond productive capacity. And this is the part nobody wants to hear because it sounds political, but it's just mathematics. As empires mature, they create more administrative roles than value-producing roles. The Byzantine Empire became a cautionary tale of this. At its height, there were more people administering the empire than defending it or producing goods for it. Bureaucracies grow because they solve immediate political problems. Someone complains, and you create a department. A crisis happens, and you add oversight. Each addition makes sense in isolation, but the cumulative weight becomes completely unsustainable. These positions require salaries, pensions, benefits. They don't generate revenue. They consume it. The Soviet Union had entire ministries dedicated to monitoring other ministries. Millions of people whose jobs existed only within the self-referential logic of the state apparatus. When oil prices dropped in the 1980s and that revenue stream dried up, there was nothing underneath, no actual productivity to fall back on. Just administrative layers that couldn't feed themselves. The United States federal workforce is over 2 million people. State and local governments add another 20 million. Many of these roles are essential, but many aren't, and every single one represents a claim on future tax revenue. When growth slows, when the tax base shrinks, these obligations don't disappear. They become anchors, dragging the entire system down. Step 3 is when resource allocation becomes political rather than economic. And this is where things start getting really dangerous. Markets work because they're ruthless feedback systems. If you make something nobody wants, you go bankrupt. If you're inefficient, someone undercuts you. It's harsh, but it's honest, and it allocates resources to their most productive use. Empires in decline stop allowing this. Instead, resources flow to whoever has political connections. Rome's grain dole started as emergency relief and became a permanent entitlement that required conquering Egypt just to sustain. The grain wasn't going to farmers or producers. It was going to urban populations who had political power through their ability to riot. Economic logic said this was insane, but political logic said it was necessary. The Soviet Union's entire economy operated this way. Factories produced goods nobody wanted because the plan said to produce them. Farms grew crops that made no sense for their climate because Moscow decided they should resources poured into prestige projects and military hardware while basic consumer goods were perpetually scarce. The whole system was one giant misallocation of capital, sustained only by the fact that there was no alternative allowed. When you can't let bad businesses fail, when you can't let inefficient industries collapse, when you bail out politically connected entities regardless of their viability, you're not preventing crisis. You're just building up pressure. The 2008 financial crisis should have restructured the entire banking sector. Instead, the politically connected institutions got bailed out, and the moral hazard became permanent policy. Too big to fail means too big to function in a market economy. Step 4 is the middle class gets hollowed out, and this is the step where social cohesion actually breaks down. Every stable empire has had a broad base of people who have something to lose. Property owners, skilled tradesmen, merchants, people who are not rich but are not desperate. They pay taxes, they follow laws, they believe the system works for them, or at least doesn't actively work against them. When currency debasement accelerates, when bureaucracy expands, when resources get allocated politically, this class gets destroyed. They can't inflate their way out like the wealthy who own assets. They can't get government support like the poor. They're stuck holding currency that's losing value and watching opportunities get distributed through channels they don't have access to. Rome's middle class of landowners got wiped out by latifundia. These massive estates owned by the ultra-wealthy and worked by slaves. They couldn't compete, and the yeoman farmer class that built the Republic simply disappeared. The Soviet Union never really had a middle class, which is part of why it was always fragile. The whole population was essentially state dependence. The United States is watching its middle class shrink in real-time homeownership, declining real wages, stagnant for decades upward, mobility becoming a myth. And here's the critical part. When the middle disappears, you are left with a small, wealthy elite and a large population with nothing to lose. That's not a recipe for stability, that is a pre-revolutionary condition. The elite wall themselves off in gated communities and financial structures the average person can't access. The masses become increasingly desperate and angry. The social contract breaks, and once it breaks, it's almost impossible to rebuild. Step 5 is the state loses monopoly on violence and legitimacy simultaneously, and this is the endgame. The final step isn't an invasion or a war, though those often happen around this time. It's the moment when people stop believing the state has the right or the ability to govern them. Rome didn't fall to the barbarians because the barbarians were stronger. Rome fell because Romans stopped thinking of themselves as part of Rome. The legions were full of Germanic soldiers who had no loyalty to the idea of Rome. The provinces stopped sending tax revenue because they didn't see the point local strongmen provided security that the empire couldn't. By the time the official end came, it was just a formality. The state had already lost the ability to enforce its will. The Soviet Union's collapse looked sudden from the outside, but it was decades in the making when Gorbachev tried to reform the system. He discovered there was nothing holding it together except force and inertia. The moment he loosened the grip, the whole thing came apart. Republics declared independence. The military stood down. It was over. Not because NATO won, but because nobody inside the system believed in it anymore. This is the step we're approaching now in multiple places, and you can see it everywhere if you're paying attention. Declining military recruitment ignored federal mandates, states openly defying the central government, the normalization of political violence, the breakdown of shared truth. When a government can't collect taxes, can't enforce laws, can't maintain infrastructure, and can't convince its own population that it deserves to exist, it doesn't matter how many aircraft carriers it has, the collapse is already underway. Here's what people miss about all of this. These steps don't happen because of policy mistakes, though there are plenty of those. They happen because of mathematical inevitability. You can't debase currency forever. You can't expand bureaucracy forever. You can't misallocate resources forever. You can't hollow out the middle class forever. You can't govern without legitimacy forever. Each step makes the next step more likely, and each step makes reversal harder. By the time you reach step 5, you're not fixing anything, you're just managing the decline. The empires that survived longest were the ones that recognized these patterns and made hard corrections early, the ones that cut spending, that reformed currency, that allowed creative destruction, that rebuilt legitimacy through actual performance rather than propaganda. But that almost never happens because the political incentives run the opposite direction. The corrections required are painful. They anger powerful constituencies. They require leaders to admit previous policies failed. So instead, every empire tells itself it's different. We have better technology, better systems, better people, and then they follow the exact same 5 steps to the exact same end. The pattern isn't hidden. It's been documented thousands of times across thousands of years. We just refuse to see it when it's happening to us.